January 1945. A frozen ridge in the dark woods of Western Europe trembles under hours of American artillery fire, until suddenly, everything stops. No shells. No smoke. Only a crushing silence so heavy that German soldiers freeze in place, unsure whether the real attack is ending, or about to begin. If you want to know why this silence terrified them more than the explosions, stay with this documentary, because the truth behind it reshaped the battlefield. To understand why silence became more frightening than the bombardment itself, we have to step back into the frozen, grinding landscape of Western Europe in early 1945. The German army was no longer the confident, fast-moving machine it had been in 1940. Its ranks were thinned by years of attrition, its supplies choked by relentless Allied bombing, and its defensive positions stretched across forests, ridges, towns, and roads that no longer offered reliable cover. Every German infantryman knew the sky could betray them, but by 1944–45, they feared something even more precise: American artillery. Across every sector, U.S. gunners had earned a reputation for timing, accuracy, and coordination that no army in the world could match. The American approach was systematic, mathematical, and executed by crews trained to fire faster, adjust quicker, and hit harder than any of their adversaries. By the final year of the war, the U.S. Army had achieved a level of artillery dominance that even German officers begrudgingly admitted surpassed their own highly respected guns. Part of this superiority came from technology, particularly the American fire direction centers that processed angles, distances, air pressure, and terrain faster than Germany's more decentralized methods. But another key factor was communication. U.S. units used radios extensively, allowing forward observers to instantly call adjustments from rooftops, tree leans, or even burning vehicles. A single observer could shift an entire battalion's guns onto a new target in seconds. German units, dependent on telephone lines regularly severed by shelling, struggled to match that level of responsiveness. Weather conditions worked against them as well. Snow choked the forest floors, turning every explosion into a spray of frozen dirt and splintered branches. Fog clung to the ridges at dawn and dusk, making it nearly impossible for German spotters to locate American guns. Even when the skies were clear, the Americans often placed their artillery far behind the front lines, hidden beyond the reach of counter-battery fire. This meant German troops rarely fired back at the guns themselves, they only endured the consequences. By early 1945, many German infantry divisions in the West were filled with exhausted veterans mixed with rushed replacements who had only weeks of training. They quickly learned the brutal rhythm of American fire missions: ranging shots, rapid corrections, then a thunderous barrage designed to tear apart defenses, morale, and communication. It became predictable, but that predictability offered a strange comfort. German troops knew how to survive sustained bombardment by diving into dugouts, pressing against tree trunks, or sheltering behind collapsed walls. But nothing prepared them for the moments when the sky suddenly fell quiet. It was in that quiet that uncertainty became unbearable. Had the Americans run out of shells? Had the guns shifted elsewhere? Or, worse, was this the signal that something much more dangerous was moving toward them? They learned quickly that American commanders rarely stopped firing without purpose. Silence was rarely an accident. It was usually a sign of precision timing, hidden maneuvers, or an imminent assault. The battlefield had entered a new phase, one shaped not only by firepower but by strategy and psychological pressure. And on certain ridges, in certain forests, American officers discovered that stillness, deliberate, chilling stillness, could be a weapon just as powerful as any shell. That realization set the stage for one of the most unsettling tactics German soldiers would face as the battles in Europe continued to tighten. The tactic of sudden artillery silence reached its sharpest effect in the bitter fighting that unfolded inside the Hürtgen Forest, one of the most unforgiving battlegrounds of the final European campaign. Stretching along the German-Belgian border, the forest was a dense maze of thick pines, steep ravines, muddy trails, and near-freezing winds that turned every movement into a slow, exhausting struggle. Visibility often dropped to only a few yards. Sound echoed unpredictably through the trees. Even veteran soldiers described the forest as a place where the war seemed to swallow light. For the Americans, advancing through the Hürtgen required a different approach than fighting in open fields or across liberated towns. Artillery could not always see its targets, and infantry units frequently moved without clear lines of sight. Yet this terrain also provided a unique tactical advantage: sound carried deep into enemy positions. Every shell, every blast, and every moment of silence traveled far beyond the front line. U.S. commanders soon realized that German troops relied heavily on the noise of American artillery to assess tempo and direction. When the barrage was constant, Germans braced for a prolonged defense. When it shifted to new sectors, they expected redeployment. But when it stopped entirely, they had no idea what was coming next. In late 1944 and early 1945, American units refined the timing of their fire missions to exploit the forest's acoustic unpredictability. Forward observers, hidden in trees, bunkers, or wrecked farmhouses, followed precise timetables. Guns fired in rolling patterns, sometimes for hours, to soften defenses, collapse bunkers, and cut communication lines. Then, without warning, the barrages halted. The silence was not a pause but a calculated moment to mask troop movements. Infantry squads slipped through the trees, engineers laid charges to break wire obstacles, and tank destroyers crawled into new firing positions under the cover of stillness. German divisions defending the forest, many already weakened by shortages and relentless pressure, suffered from the psychological weight of these tactical silences. Reports describe soldiers huddling in foxholes, unsure whether the Americans were shifting targets, advancing silently, or preparing a larger breakthrough. Commanders frequently misread the silence as a sign that U.S. units were reorganizing or waiting for new supply lines. But more often, it meant that American infantry was moving into the shadows, closing distance before the next planned strike. One particularly effective technique was the silent handover, where American artillery ceased fire just long enough for frontline units to infiltrate weak points in the German line. The Germans, hearing no shells, often emerged from cover or repositioned themselves, only to be caught off guard when the next phase of the attack began at close range. In several engagements, U.S. forces achieved surprise not through overwhelming fire but through the absence of it. The Hürtgen became the proving ground for a tactic built on patience, coordination, and psychological leverage. Silence turned into a tool as sharp as any bombardment. It allowed American units to overcome a terrain designed for defense and to exploit fear where noise had once dominated. This battlefield, shaped by both thunder and stillness, created the foundation for the angles you are about to explore, angles that explain why German soldiers feared the quiet as much as the storm. Fear inside the Hürtgen Forest did not come from a single cause. It grew from a combination of psychology, technology, and timing, layers that wrapped around German soldiers until silence itself felt like an enemy approaching. The first layer was emotional. For months, German infantry had been conditioned to expect American artillery as a constant presence. They heard the ranging shots, felt the thump of air pressure, watched treetops explode into wooden shrapnel. The rhythm became familiar, almost mechanical. In a strange way, the noise was predictable. When the Americans fired, Germans understood the pattern: endure the barrage, stay low, ride out the storm. But when the noise stopped, there was no pattern left to hold on to. Stillness meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant danger. Veteran German officers later noted that silence created more tension than bombardment because it left them blind, unable to guess where the next blow would fall. The second layer came from American precision. The U.S. artillery network in the forest was not a chaotic mass of guns firing blindly, it was a coordinated grid with fire direction centers calculating every angle. Observers used radios to shift shells only inches at a time. Some forward teams had trained so well that they could walk explosions across a ridgeline like a typewriter moving from letter to letter. Germans facing this level of accuracy often believed the Americans had an unlimited supply of ammunition. In reality, the U.S. Army simply used ammunition more efficiently than any other force of the war. Guns fired only when needed, always with purpose. This efficiency created the illusion of endless capability, which was terrifying enough on its own. But it was the control, the deliberate pauses, the calculated lulls, that broke German confidence. Whenever American guns fell silent, German troops knew it was not due to weakness. It was due to choice. And that choice almost always meant something was being repositioned, prepared, or advanced under cover of the quiet. Infantry could be crawling forward. Engineers could be cutting wire. Tanks could be moving between tree lines. Or observers could be shifting attention to targets that had not yet revealed themselves. Silence meant the Americans were doing something they did not want heard. That understanding spread through the forest like a cold wind. Units whispered about attacks that came immediately after quiet periods. Some soldiers refused to leave their foxholes when the gun stopped, convinced that stepping outside meant walking into a trap. The silence of American artillery became a shadow that moved ahead of every assault, creeping through snow-covered branches and settling over German positions like a warning they could never fully interpret. And within that warning, the next set of tensions began to build, tensions that shaped the way German troops reacted to every moment of quiet that followed. Silence in the Hürtgen Forest did more than unsettle German troops, it repeatedly led them into fatal misjudgments. Months of fighting had worn down their communication networks, leaving commanders dependent on scattered reports, unreliable phone lines, and the instincts of men operating under immense stress. When American artillery paused, divisions often interpreted it through the lens of desperation rather than design. Some believed the Americans were running low on shells. Others assumed the U.S. infantry was exhausted or reorganizing. A few convinced themselves the barrage had shifted elsewhere, giving them a brief window to move supplies, rotate squads, or repair trenches. These assumptions were dangerous. American officers understood how predictable human behavior could be under pressure. They studied German tendencies, monitored their defensive patterns, and learned that silence created opportunities for enemy movement, opportunities they could exploit with devastating efficiency. German diaries and post-war accounts reveal how deeply this fear of quiet seeped into their daily routines. Soldiers wrote about the forest feeling alive whenever the guns stopped, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Some men described gripping their rifles so tightly their knuckles went white, waiting for shapes to emerge from the mist. Others mentioned the unnerving sensation that American troops were already behind them, creeping through the undergrowth with a patience the Germans struggled to match. In one account, a German non-commissioned officer wrote that the worst moments were not during bombardments but during the eerie stretches that followed, the minutes when you know something is coming but cannot see or hear what it is. This human fear was amplified by American tactics on the ground. U.S. infantry and engineers learned to move precisely during these quiet intervals, stepping over fallen branches, brushing aside snow, and coordinating hand signals to avoid breaking the silence the artillery had created. Tanks and tank destroyers stayed idle until the forest masked their engines. Machine gun teams positioned themselves in advance, waiting to open fire the moment the next barrage resumed. Every American movement was guided by discipline, while every German reaction was shaped by doubt. The contrast created a psychological imbalance that grew with each engagement. German soldiers began to perceive the silence not as absence, but as presence, a sign that the Americans were close, studying them, choosing their moment. This belief pushed them into premature withdrawals, frantic repositioning, or rigid inaction at times when flexibility might have saved them. And as these patterns repeated, battle after battle, the stage was set for the moment when silence would become more than a tactic. It would become the turning point of the fight itself, the instant when the forest held its breath just before the American assault finally struck. The turning point arrived on a morning when the sky above the Hürtgen hung low with winter mist, and the ground lay frozen beneath a thin crust of frost. For hours, American artillery had hammered the German line, steady, methodical, relentless. Shells burst in tight patterns along ridges, shattered bunkers, and tore apart the narrow logging roads the defenders used to move between positions. German troops endured the storm with the grim discipline forged through years of war. They stayed low, counted impacts, and whispered to one another that the barrage would eventually end. It did, but not the way they expected. Just after 0900, the final American rounds crashed into the front edge of the German defenses. Splintered wood rained down, smoke drifted between the trees, and the echo of the last explosion rolled away into the forest. The Germans waited for the next wave. 10 seconds passed. Then 30. Then 60. The second minute ticked forward in complete, unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Silence settled over the ridgeline like a blanket pressed against the earth. For the Germans, that stillness carried a weight more crushing than the explosions. The abrupt stop disrupted their senses, broke their rhythm, and left them unable to determine whether the attack had paused or ended. Some assumed the Americans were adjusting coordinates. Others thought the guns had shifted to another sector. Experienced men, however, recognized something far more dangerous. The Americans had chosen this silence. And chosen silence usually meant an attack was already underway. Hidden behind the next slope, American infantry crouched in the cold, waiting for the signal they had rehearsed. Platoon leaders checked watches. Riflemen tightened straps, adjusted gloves, and scanned the forest ahead. Engineers held Bangalore torpedoes close to the ground, careful not to disturb the snow. Tank destroyers idled at low throttle, engines muffled under tarps and brush. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, and synchronized with the quiet that now pressed against the trees. When the moment came, the Americans advanced like a shadow spreading across the forest floor. They moved in staggered lines, stepping over fallen logs, navigating between shattered stumps, keeping the silence intact. Forward observers followed closely behind, ready to call the next phase. Machine gun crews set up firing lanes. Mortar teams stabilized tubes for rapid use. It was a rare moment in a chaotic war, a large formation moving in near-complete stillness, coordinated down to the second. The Germans heard nothing. They saw nothing. And that blindness created the decisive opening. A German squad leader, nervously peering from his foxhole, signaled to two riflemen to shift positions. He believed the Americans had stepped back to regroup. He was wrong. As the two soldiers stood, American rifles cracked from less than 50 yards away. The shots echoed sharply, breaking the silence like glass under a hammer. In seconds, the forest erupted. American fire swept across the first German trench line. Machine guns raked bunkers. Mortars dropped behind fleeing troops. Tanks pushed through the trees, their treads smashing roots and rocks. Engineers blew gaps through wire and timber. Infantry surged through these openings with speed and confidence formed through weeks of coordinated training. German defenders, startled and disoriented, struggled to return fire. Many fired at shadows or into empty spaces, unsure where the Americans had come from. What made this moment decisive was not overwhelming numbers, it was the timing. German commanders attempted to issue orders, but communication lines had been severed earlier by artillery. Runners were delayed or lost. Units acted independently, reacting rather than organizing. And in a forest where every second mattered, reacting meant falling behind. American units seized the advantage. They captured bunkers before German troops inside realized they were surrounded. They advanced past defensive pockets that still believed the main attack was elsewhere. They coordinated suppressive fire with flawless precision, each element reinforcing the next. The forest became a network of small, violent engagements, each tilted in favor of the Americans, each amplified by the confusion created in those silent minutes before the assault. German resistance did not collapse all at once. They fought with stubbornness, as they had throughout the war. But the shock of the ambush, engineered entirely from the pause in artillery, fractured their cohesion. Some squads fell back. Others surrendered. A few held out longer, firing until their positions were overrun. And through it all, the Americans pressed forward, driven by momentum born not in noise, but in perfect, chilling stillness. The breakthrough had begun. The balance of the battle had shifted. And the consequences of that shift would soon stretch far beyond the shattered treeline where the silence first fell. When the firing tapered off and the smoke thinned between the trees, the scale of what had happened in those brief minutes of silence became unmistakable. The American advance had not been a massive tidal wave crashing through the forest, it had been a series of precise, coordinated strikes launched at the perfect moment of psychological vulnerability. And that moment had shattered the German line more effectively than any prolonged bombardment could have done on its own. Across the ridgeline, American units consolidated their gains with practiced discipline. Platoon leaders marked captured bunkers. Engineers cleared paths for supply jeeps and stretcher teams. Machine gun crews repositioned to cover possible counterattacks, though few came. The forest floor was scarred with craters, broken timber, and abandoned equipment. But in the spaces where the Germans had attempted to regroup, the evidence of disarray was even more revealing: scorched papers, hastily discarded ammunition boxes, field phones smashed or left dangling, and rifles dropped in hurried retreat. The Germans had not been a weak force. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front or earlier campaigns in France. They had built their defenses with care, using the forest's natural density as a shield. They had endured months of combat in some of the most punishing terrain of the war. But this time, they had been defeated by something they could not anticipate or counter: the complete unpredictability of American timing. Reports written after the battle, both Allied and German, described the collapse in stark terms. German battalion logs noted units losing contact without explanation or retreating after misinterpreting artillery pause. American after-action summaries credited the advance not to overwhelming numbers but to shock effect, produced by silence used as part of the fire plan. One U.S. commander remarked that the Germans had reacted as if the forest itself turned against them. It wasn't the forest. It was the absence of sound, engineered with intent. By midday, American forces had penetrated deeper into the Hürtgen sector than they had in the previous week. Several fortified positions, once considered nearly impossible to approach, fell within hours. Captured German soldiers, exhausted and visibly shaken, struggled to explain what they had experienced. Many mentioned the same detail: the moment the American gun stopped. For them, that silence had been the warning they never fully understood. They expected another barrage, not the sudden arrival of infantry from multiple angles. Morale among the defenders had taken a hit that extended beyond this single engagement. As word spread through remaining German positions, officers found it increasingly difficult to reassure their troops. Some soldiers refused to leave cover during quiet periods, convinced the silence masked the next attack. Others insisted on rotating their squads more frequently, fearful that staying still made them vulnerable. Even among experienced fighters, confidence in their ability to read the battlefield had been shaken. The Americans, meanwhile, capitalized on the psychological advantage. Each captured line strengthened their supply routes. Each cleared path allowed artillery to reposition and support the next push. The forest remained deadly, its traps and terrain would continue to claim lives, but the balance had shifted. Momentum now belonged firmly to the U.S. forces. Strategically, the breakthrough accelerated plans for further advances along the German frontier. It forced the German command to divert resources, pull back reserves, and reconsider defensive priorities. Every mile lost strained their already thin ranks and overburdened logistics. And as they scrambled to compensate, they found themselves increasingly reacting to American movements rather than shaping the course of engagement. The aftermath of that silent-driven assault was not just territorial. It was mental. The Germans had learned an unsettling truth: American artillery, already feared for its accuracy and volume, had acquired a new dimension: the power to weaponize silence. That lesson changed how both sides approached the battles that followed, shaping a final phase of the war marked by disruption, shock, and a growing sense that American dominance could appear out of nowhere, carried on the back of quiet that came before the storm. When historians look back at the final months of World War II, they often focus on the great offensives, the armored thrusts, and the sweeping movements across liberated territory. But within those larger arcs were moments like the one in the Hürtgen, moments shaped not by overwhelming firepower alone, but by timing, discipline, and an understanding of human fear. The Americans had mastered more than just the science of artillery. They had mastered the rhythm of battle itself, knowing when sound could break an enemy's will, and when silence could do the same. For the German soldiers who lived through it, the memory of those quiet intervals stayed with them long after the forest had fallen silent for good. Many later admitted that the unpredictability of American tactics, especially the sudden disappearance of noise, made the battlefield feel unstable, as if the ground itself might shift at any moment. It forced them to fight not only the enemy in front of them but the uncertainty inside their own thoughts. For the Americans, the lesson was equally profound. Victory did not always come from the largest barrage or the loudest advance. Sometimes it came from coordination, patience, and the knowledge that a single moment of stillness could create an opening wider than any crater. Silence had become a weapon, sharper than shrapnel, more precise than any shell. And as the war pressed forward toward its final conclusion, that idea carried with it a quiet truth: dominance on the battlefield was not only measured by how loudly an army could strike, but by how effectively it controlled the spaces between the noise.